So yeah, as I was saying, I'm a Mitra of the community here at the Melbourne Buddhist Centre, Mitra being a Sanskrit word for friend. I'm also, as many of you know, the current centre manager, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in person once we can safely gather again at the MBC. Tonight I'm going to be talking about why I am a Buddhist, sharing some reflections on my personal journey and what I've learnt in my time with this community. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people as the traditional custodians of the land that connects us from beyond this Zoom gathering. I'd also like to offer a content warning. I'm going to be sharing some snippets of my personal history, which involves talking about mental illness, addiction, and a brief mention of suicidal ideation. I'm not going to be going into any of it too deeply, but I'd like to give people a chance to check in with themselves before listening to this talk. And with that, I'll begin with the following verse. With hands folded in reverence and terrified of suffering, I pay salutations again and again. May the leaders receive this kindly, just as it is with its many faults. What is not good, O protectors, I shall not do again. As some of you may know, these lines are from the Confession of Faults verse in the Sevenfold Puja, which is a Buddhist ritual that our community performs once a month near the full moon. The words terrified of suffering were the first thing that occurred to me when I was asked to give a talk on why I am a Buddhist. And as someone with a complex relationship with identity and labels, I thought it would be a fun challenge. So about 3 or 4 years ago, when I first came across the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, rock bottom was an all too familiar place. I have a history of poor mental health with long bouts of depression, and I've spent many years living in a state of survival, feeling as though I had a lack of control over my life. I'd become fairly detached from reality after a brief visit to the psychiatric ward, so it wasn't hard for me to put everything aside that I believed in up until that point, in order to allow myself to be receptive to what the teachings were telling me. And what I've been struck by most deeply is the concept of karma. Karma is a Sanskrit word for action, and in many Eastern religions is believed to be a natural law of the universe that determines future consequences based on one's actions of body, speech, and mind. The Buddha was more specific about this, saying the main determining factor was the intention behind our actions, which in many ways shapes who we are and how we experience the world. This distinction was a huge revelation for me as it started to shed light on the ways I'd been creating some of my own suffering and helped me see a way forward. The law of karma is the basis of the 5 precepts, which are an ethical framework in Buddhism that provide a way of living that causes less harm to ourselves and others. Now, I had no idea about transformative power of the precepts before I took them on. Really obsessed with learning meditation because I wanted to reach deep. It seemed very interesting or important to me. It took a while to realize this was motivated by an underlying desire to escape. I've just noticed my connections. Give me a thumbs up if it's all good. Yeah. To escape my internal connection, my internal experience, rather than to become more intimate with it. I've since found there's something protective about living by the precepts, which I desperately needed. Living a more ethical life leaves you with a clean conscience, which in turn gives you more confidence in the world. But it also means taking full responsibility for ourselves, where we no longer expect others to clean up after us. My ethical practice has completely changed the way I live, and I continue to find more and more ways to develop a sensitivity to this. The precepts have given me a sense of agency where I might otherwise feel powerless over my emotional or mental experience, which is important because when I started to look deeper in meditation, What I found beneath my self-destructive behaviors was shame. In Buddhism, shame is known as a positive mental event because it shows you where you're failing to live up to your values. And it's been such an interesting doorway into the Dharma for me because suddenly there was something I could do about it other than try to ignore what I was feeling, which inevitably colored my mental states and led to a downward spiral. I've been really reckless at times, trying to escape what I'm feeling by putting myself in danger, often fueled by troubles with substance abuse. I'd been making a mess of my life, having all but given up after realizing I didn't have the strength to end it. I found refuge in meditation, but it was my contact with the Sangha, a spiritual community of fellow practitioners, that really started to set me straight, if I could ever really refer to myself as straight. When I first came to the Sangha, I managed to stay completely sober for about a year, which was a huge breakthrough. Such is the power of shame in the right context. It was such a stark contrast when, due to the pressures of last year, many of these problems flared up again. Having been so immersed in Sangha before the lockdowns of 2020, I really noticed the impact it had on my commitment to keeping the precepts when I couldn't connect with people who were trying to live a life in accordance with the Dharma. My resilience suffered, my addictions came back stronger than ever. And in seeing such a sharp turnaround, I realized certain things about my need for community and the importance of Sangha. Practicing among like-minded people and having publicly taken precepts, there's more motivation to continue growing and developing my ethical sensibilities. After reading Maitreya Bandhu's Journey in the Guide earlier this year, I was inspired to begin a confession group with two very good friends of mine. And it's become such an important space to talk about the ways I'm not living up to my values. I'm finding there's something empowering in being responsible for myself, which sounds pretty obvious, but it wasn't something I'd fully accepted until I became a Buddhist. One of my favorite teachings from the early suttas, discourses, is that of the 5 daily reflections suggested by the Buddha, the last of which really rubs it in your face. He tells us to remember the following: I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and have my actions as my arbitrator. Whatever I do, for good or for evil, to that will I fall heir. So Buddhism really holds us accountable to how we act in this world. It doesn't allow us to escape ourselves. And in fact, it says that we can't. But then it gives us tools to be able to turn towards the most difficult things in our experience with courage, acceptance, and support in a way that allows for transformation to occur. Owning up to our imperfections allows us to live more fully. But sometimes we're not ready to take responsibility for certain aspects of ourselves, and sometimes the conditions we're in aren't conducive to our growth or are beyond our control to change, much like the last year or so. But through practice, situations in which I've felt and find creative possibilities to thrive. Learning, my connection's gone funny again.
We just the last 30 seconds or so that we.
All right.
Just when you said, we lost you when you said through practice, Bruce.
Okay. Through practice, situations in which I felt powerless have become opportunities to work with my emotions and find creative possibilities to thrive. Learning to meditate and to really confidently be able to sit with my experience has been life-saving. That being said, it's important to acknowledge that meditation can uncover things that can be incredibly painful. but it also acts as a container in which to hold those experiences. Whether I'm seething with anger, or crying from exhaustion, or feeling like I'm about to burst out laughing in a room full of meditators, it feels necessary to give my body and mind the space to just be, to unfold, and to play. I don't want to give the wrong impression that meditation for me is always full of excitement or agitation, but I often think about metta, loving kindness, and how heartbreaking it can be, because it does open you up to so much emotionally that we normally try and protect ourselves from. This can be overwhelming or confusing at times, and seems to be part of why it's so important to be practicing within a community, to be able to share your experiences with people that regularly meditate and can help you navigate the things that come up. I remember on Tejananda's retreat earlier last year, having the space to really pay attention to my body. I started to notice a knot in my throat that felt like some kind of emotional energy was trapped. But it was so subtle that I only ever felt this in meditation. It was tangible enough that I decided to go to the doctors though, to get it checked out. And lo and behold, it turned out I had thyroid cancer. The shock of this during the pandemic shook my world, but it put me in contact with my mortality and sense of purpose in a way that I couldn't turn away from. When I first got the diagnosis and was told the risks of surgery, one of the small percentages that they have to tell you was that there was a chance that I might lose the ability to sing. And I remember these words came into my head so strongly. It was just saying, like, you have to use your voice or you will lose it. Like, it's just over and over in my head. And as the saying goes, happiness comes from within, but sometimes the body already knows what it needs and we're just not listening closely enough. For me, it was like this blockage in expression had begun to manifest as sickness. And luckily through awareness, I'd been able to catch it early. I wanted to share this as an act of vulnerability, but also as an example of how increased awareness can help us follow our hearts and find what's truly important to us. And if anything, that is why I'm a Buddhist. But that's not to forget the Bodhisattva ideal, as referred to by Bhante Sangharakshita, who was and is the founder of this community. The Bodhisattva ideal, or the altruistic desire to gain enlightenment for the sake of all beings, wasn't something I felt drawn to at first. I couldn't hold such a lofty ideal from a place of so much suffering. And as I'm sure is common for many people who seek out Buddhism, what I desperately needed was refuge. It's amazing what a sense of community can do, though, and it didn't take me long to realize that my happiness depends on your happiness, which depends on the happiness of everyone in each and every one of our own lives and beyond. Another verse from the Sevenfold Puja in the section following confession. I rejoice in the arising of the will to enlightenment and the teaching, those oceans that bring happiness to all beings and are the abode of welfare of all beings. So I'd like to share another story with you. 10 years ago, I was living in Meanjin, which is an Indigenous word from the Turrbal language group referring to the area known as Brisbane. I was renting a house with some friends next to the river, and we'd only just moved in about a month or so before the floods happened in 2011. Almost overnight, the house went under, along with several blocks around the neighbourhood, not to mention most of the state. It took about 2 weeks for the water to go down, during which time sewage had poured into the river from upstream and left everything covered in toxic mud. By the time we could get back into the house, there were already so many people involved in the cleanup. I barely got my hands dirty because I was so busy taking phone calls and directing people that wanted to volunteer their time. There were some people who literally wandered from door to door, asking if they could help in any way. People just came out of the woodwork. I was absolutely stunned. I'd never seen the way generosity could flow so easy on such a massive scale. It's said that the arising of the bodhicitta, the will to enlightenment, can arise more easily in situations where people come together for something greater than themselves. And I think we're going to see a lot more of the need for this as the climate crisis becomes worse. What we're doing in Sangha, though, is intentionally creating space for that to happen, practicing going beyond ourselves rather than waiting for disaster to strike. But it's not easy to let go of our habitual preferences and ego clinging. And on that note, I'll leave you with a final perspective. As a non-binary transgender person, I've spent so long trying to figure out who I am, undergoing many changes in gender expression, both socially and physically. My understanding of identity feels intimately tied to my experience of the body, but also to the way I'm perceived by others. I find it hard to recognize who I am sometimes when people don't see me the way I experience myself to be, even though that experience is changing all the time and will continue to change. So much change can be destabilizing, and something as small as using the wrong name or pronouns that I've chosen can have a huge impact on my sense of self. But I'm finding that it's during the process of change that the possibility for positive growth feels more alive, as well as the potential for letting go. Our conditions and conditioning shape who we are, which in turn shapes the world around us and how we experience it, and our consciousness changes with it, despite the illusion of an ongoing sense of self. We can eventually look back and recognize how we've changed, but it's hard to understand what we're becoming when so much of this journey seems to be about being aware of what we're becoming as much as it is about being in the moment and learning from the past. It's taken time to really define myself as a Buddhist, particularly as a Westerner without a strong connection beyond this community to the people and cultures that have helped develop and transmit the teachings that I now benefit from. But with interest and respect for lineage, I feel connected to the Buddha as a spiritual ancestor of the human race, who showed us through his own efforts that human beings have the potential for enlightenment, which is a rare and precious thing. And we're lucky to be living in a time when the Dharma is still able to be heard. I'll finish with a poem that I wrote earlier this year during lockdown 3, or maybe 4, I've lost count. This life is not a story, but a mind unfolding within the confines of flesh and time. Faith may wax and wane, but the heart leads back home again, where the song first began and will eventually end.